My name is Zania Harper. I am 65 years old, a retired librarian in a quiet town in Vermont. Most of my days are filled with books, letters from friends, and small visits to the market. I live alone in the house where my late husband and I once raised our son, Daniel. People who meet me now think of me as a woman who carries herself with calm dignity. But on the day of Daniel's second wedding, calmness was the last thing in my heart. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, flowers, and the sound of violins. Everyone's attention was on the groom and his radiant new bride. I sat beside my 6-year-old granddaughter, Nora, who clutched a little red yarn doll to her chest, as if it were her only lifeline. I leaned down to ask her if she was all right, and that was when her small hand gripped mine with surprising force. Her fingers trembled against my skin, and in a hushed, shaky whisper, she said, "Grandma, we have to leave right now." I frowned, confused, and before I could even respond, she pointed under the long, draped tablecloth. Her eyes were wide with a terror far too heavy for such a young child. "Look under the table," she breathed. For a moment, I thought she was imagining something, the way children sometimes do when they feel out of place. But the way her voice cracked, the way her lower lip trembled, told me she was not playing. My heart began to pound, though I forced my face to remain calm for her sake. I bent lower, pretending to adjust my shawl, and felt the heavy stillness of the wedding hall pressing around us. Laughter and clinking glasses swirled above, but under that table lay a silence that threatened to break everything I believed about my son's new marriage. Nora pressed closer into me, the red yarn doll caught between us. I could smell the faint lavender of her hair shampoo and feel her shallow, rapid breaths. "Grandma," she whispered again, her voice cracking into something almost like a sob. "Please." Her urgency struck me harder than the music, harder than the polite applause rising for the couple at the far end of the room. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I had no choice but to trust the frightened child who had never lied to me. In that instant, I saw the wedding not as a glittering celebration, but as a stage hiding shadows. The bride's perfect smile, the elegant tables, the polished speeches, they all seemed like veils. What mattered was the trembling hand of a 6-year-old girl begging her grandmother to see the truth that adults had missed. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat, shifted slightly in my chair, and prepared to do what I had done all my life as a librarian. Look closely, notice details, uncover what was hidden between the lines. Perhaps you have been in a moment like that, when the room is full of people celebrating, yet you feel utterly alone in knowing something is not right. It is a peculiar loneliness, and it can change the course of an entire family. For me, it began with a whisper and a glance under the table at my son's second wedding. If you have ever felt the silent weight of protecting someone you love, you will understand why I could not ignore her words. And if you stay with me, I will take you through every moment of what happened next, the secrets, the heartbreak, and the quiet strength it demanded. Stories like this are not just mine. They belong to anyone who has ever chosen love and truth over appearances. If my story stirs something in you, I invite you to share your own in the comments. We are never too old to tell the truth about our families, and we are never too late to begin again. Nora's whisper was only the beginning. What I discovered when I bent closer that night changed everything I thought I knew about Daniel, about the woman he had just married, and about the fragile line between safety and danger for the little girl who trusted me completely. Now let me take you back into that ballroom, into the glittering light that masked the shadows beneath, and show you what my granddaughter forced me to see. The ballroom that evening glimmered like a scene borrowed from a fairy tale. Golden chandeliers showered light onto round tables draped in ivory cloth, each centerpiece a bouquet of pale roses and flickering candles. The air carried the scent of wine and sugared pastries. Guests dressed in elegant suits and gowns laughed easily, clinking glasses and whispering their admiration for the perfect couple at the center of it all. At the head of the hall stood my son, Daniel Harper, tall and smiling, his arm around the bride who now wore his name. Daniel had always been a handsome man, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes the kind that once held both intelligence and warmth. But that evening, though his smile reached his lips, I could not tell if it reached his soul. Still, he looked proud, almost relieved, as though this second chance at happiness would finally erase the shadows of his past. Beside him stood Selina Ward, now Mrs. Harper. Her dress was silk and glitter, every fold flowing like water, her face painted with a smile too precise, too polished. She was 34, poised and radiant, her gestures practiced for admiration. She greeted guests with both hands extended, kissed cheeks, bent graciously to listen, and laughed like silver bells. Many whispered how perfect she was for Daniel, how lucky he was to have found such beauty after his loss. Yet as I watched her lean into my son's shoulder, something about her eyes unsettled me. They seemed to watch the room the way a hawk watches a field, not with warmth, but calculation. At my table, 6-year-old Nora sat stiffly, her small legs dangling from the chair too tall for her. She had a plate of untouched food in front of her and her red yarn doll pressed to her chest. Her big brown eyes, Elise's eyes, flickered toward her father, then darted away whenever Selina's gaze passed over her. She looked misplaced, in the grandeur of it all, as if she had wandered into a theater production where every actor knew their lines, but she had forgotten hers. I brushed her hair gently and tried to coax her to eat a piece of bread. She shook her head and whispered, "I'm not hungry." My hand moved to the small card I always kept tucked in my purse, her shellfish allergy note. I had carried it since she was old enough to feed herself, and Elise used to tease me for checking menus twice. Elise had called it a librarian's habit, always cataloging, always prepared. Even after Elise's death, I never left home without that card, because one mistake could cost too much. Tonight, of all nights, I felt its sharp weight inside my bag. Across the table, Clara sat quietly, her posture graceful yet modest, her hands folded on her lap. At 27, she had become a steady presence in our lives. I had adopted Clara when she was nearly grown, long after Daniel had left home, so she was never raised as his sibling. She was more like an aunt or an older cousin, though over time she had become so much more. She filled the silence Elise had left, caring for Nora in ways that went beyond duty. Clara's eyes followed Nora tenderly, watching her with the attentiveness of someone who carried a child's trust like a fragile bird in her palms. She had dressed simply for the wedding, a pale blue gown without glitter, her beauty quiet but undeniable. Guests moved between tables with the fluidity of a tide. Waiters passed with trays of champagne and sparkling cider. Toasts rose in the air, praising Daniel's resilience, praising Selina's grace, praising the hope of new beginnings. I listened, but my mind wandered back to Elise. She'd been the kind of woman who never sought praise, who found joy in bedtime stories and muddy shoes on the porch. Her absence hovered in the room like an uninvited ghost, unseen but undeniable. For Daniel, this day was meant to mark the end of mourning and the start of something brighter. For me, it was impossible to pretend that a life could simply be replaced. Selina drifted toward our table for a moment, her hand brushing lightly over Nora's hair. "How is my little flower?" she asked sweetly. Nora stiffened, clutching her doll closer, her lips pressed shut. Selina's smile never faltered, but I saw her eyes flicker with something sharper than annoyance. She patted Nora's shoulder and turned back to the crowd with effortless charm, her laughter floating once more into the glittering air. Daniel approached us soon after, his expression glowing with the pride of a groom. "Mom," he said, leaning to kiss my cheek, "thank you for being here. It means the world." His voice held the familiar timbre of my little boy, the one who used to bring me wildflowers from the yard. Yet when he spoke, I also felt the distance that had grown between us in recent years, a space filled with work, loss, and now a new wife who seemed to want to shape him into her world. Nora tugged my sleeve, whispering, "Grandma, can we go home after the cake?" I kissed her forehead and told her we would see, though my heart clenched at the thought of her discomfort. A child's instincts are rarely wrong, and I promised myself I would pay attention. Around us, the music swelled, violins reaching a crescendo as Daniel lifted his glass to toast the future. Guests cheered, glasses clinked, and Selena leaned into his side, the picture of triumph. But under the table, my granddaughter's small hand never let go of mine, her fingers cold with worry. Her silence spoke louder than the orchestra, and I understood. This wedding was not just a celebration, it was also a test, and perhaps even a danger. There are moments in life when memory feels more vivid than the present, and that night in the ballroom, my thoughts kept slipping back to Elise. As the music played and the crowd laughed around me, it was her voice I heard, her laughter I remembered echoing in the kitchen of my old house. Elise had been more than a daughter-in-law. She was like the daughter I never had until Clara came later. She had a way of drawing people in, not through grandeur or charm, but through kindness so genuine it softened every corner of a room. I remembered one evening, years ago, when Nora was still a toddler. She had been running a fever that wouldn't break. Her cheeks flushed, her small body restless and hot. Daniel was away for work, anxious from a distance but helpless to return. Elise stayed awake all night, rocking Nora gently, humming old lullabies her mother had sung to her. I had sat on the couch nearby, offering tea and quiet prayers, and I watched Elise's devotion with a heart both aching and grateful. At dawn, Nora's fever broke, and Elise wept with relief, her hair damp against her temples, her voice hoarse from singing. That was the kind of mother she was, steady, uncomplaining, and fierce in her love. It still felt impossible that she was gone. The accident had come without warning, a single brutal curve in the road on a rainy night. Daniel had called me past midnight, his voice hollow, the words hardly making sense. "She's gone, Mom," he had whispered, as though saying it too loudly would make it more real. When I arrived at the hospital, the silence of the waiting room told me everything before the doctor spoke. Nora, just 4 years old then, slept curled against my chest while Daniel stood with his head in his hands, his body shaking. I don't think I will ever forget the weight of that night, the way loss pressed down on us like a storm no one could escape. In the months that followed, the house felt empty no matter how many people filled it. Elise's handwriting lingered on recipe cards, her voice on a recording tucked inside a greeting card that played when opened, her library card left in a drawer. Each small thing was both comfort and torment. Nora would sometimes wander through the rooms calling, "Mama," as though Elise had just stepped into another space and would return any moment. I tried to soothe her, but grief does not obey reason. Daniel, crushed by sorrow, turned to work with a desperation that left little room for anything else. He could not bear to sit still in a home that reminded him of what he had lost. Meetings, late nights, business trips. He filled every minute as if outrunning grief could save him. I understood his escape, even if it broke my heart. He loved Elise deeply, and to lose her so suddenly had unmoored him completely. For Nora, the loss was different. Children do not understand death in the way adults do. She would stare at Elise's picture, ask where she had gone, then play quietly with her doll as though nothing had happened. But every so often, I would see her freeze, her eyes filling with tears she could not name. It was in those moments that I promised myself I would stand in the gap. Whatever Daniel could not give in his grief, I would provide. because Elise had entrusted me with her daughter by loving me as a mother, too. The memory that pressed against me most that night in the ballroom was one of Elise standing by the garden, laughing as Nora chased butterflies. She had turned to me and said, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll keep her safe." At the time, I had scolded her gently, telling her not to speak of such things. But the words had lodged in me like seeds. Now, watching Nora clutch her red yarn doll and shrink from her father's new wife, those words burned in my chest. Elise was gone, but her plea remained, echoing louder than the orchestra, louder than the toasts. I reached for Nora's hand under the table, holding it with a grip that told her without words, "I will not fail you." Elise's spirit was not gone, not really. It lingered in every protective instinct I carried, every quiet decision to stand guard. I believed then, as I believe now, that love like hers does not vanish. It simply changes form, becoming memory, becoming strength, becoming the whisper that pushes us forward when everything else feels impossible. That wedding was supposed to mark a new beginning for Daniel. For me, it was a night filled with the past, with reminders of the woman who had once brought light into our family. And in the frightened eyes of my granddaughter, I saw Elise's legacy, a child who still needed protection, still needed love, and still needed the promise I had made in the garden long ago. After Elise's death, Daniel was never the same. The man who once lingered over bedtime stories, who used to kneel beside Nora's crib to whisper prayers into her curls, began to vanish behind a wall of meetings, phone calls, and late nights at the office. Grief had not only taken his wife, it had stolen his softness. He became determined to keep everything moving forward, as though progress alone could silence the ache inside him. I remember mornings when he would drop Nora off at my house with a rushed kiss on her head, his tie already knotted, his car idling outside. "Thanks, Mom," he would say, his voice clipped, his eyes darting to the clock. He always promised he would be back before bedtime, but more often than not, he returned long after she was asleep. He would stand in her doorway staring at her small body curled under blankets, guilt flickering across his face like a passing shadow. Yet the next morning, the cycle repeated. That was when Clara quietly stepped into the gap. She had been living with me for only a short time then, still finding her place in the family I had built after years of widowhood. I had adopted her when she was already nearly grown, not to give her a sibling, but to give her a home. Daniel, by then a man in his 30s, had accepted her as my choice, though they were never raised as brother and sister. Still, I had not expected the bond she would form with Nora, a bond that proved to be more healing than any of us could have imagined. Clara had an artist's soul. She carried a sketchbook everywhere, filling it with drawings of flowers, people on the street, or sometimes the old rocking chair in the corner of my living room. She began to invite Nora to draw with her, placing crayons and paper on the kitchen table. At first, Nora scribbled absent-mindedly, her grief too fresh, but soon she started to create pictures of houses, of smiling faces, of the little red yarn doll Elise had made for her. Clara never corrected her lines or pushed her to be neat. She only encouraged her, praising each stroke as if it were a masterpiece. In those moments, Nora's laughter returned in small bursts, fragile but real. On nights when fever struck or nightmares kept Nora awake, it was Clara who slipped into her room, sitting patiently by the bed until the little girl fell asleep again. I often found them in the morning, Nora's tiny hand curled around Clara's fingers, the two of them breathing in rhythm, one child and one young woman carrying each other through sorrow. Those images carved themselves into my memory as proof that family is not always blood. Sometimes it is the love we choose and the care we give without condition. Daniel noticed, though he rarely spoke of it, I would catch him watching Clara and Nora together, Clara tying a scarf around the child's neck before school or helping her build a kite in the yard. His expression would soften briefly, but then he turned away, burying himself in work once more. Perhaps he was ashamed of how much he had withdrawn. Perhaps he did not yet know how to live in the emptiness Elise had left behind. Still, there were moments that hinted at something deeper. One afternoon, I stood by the window and saw Daniel pause in the driveway. Clara was crouched beside Nora, laughing as they painted the sidewalk with chalk. Daniel leaned against his car for a long time, his face unreadable, before he finally joined them, sitting. Awkwardly on the pavement in his expensive suit, Nora squealed with delight, and Clara smiled in a way that lit the entire moment. It was brief, but it told me something important. The part of Daniel that Elise had loved was not gone forever. It was simply buried, waiting for the right kind of patience to draw it out again. Clara, for her part, never sought recognition. She carried her role as though it were natural, not forced. She packed lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside, little hearts or reminders that said, "You're brave," or "I believe in you." She made sure Nora's allergy medicine was always close at hand. She memorized the list of foods to avoid, repeating it until it was second nature. She never asked Daniel for thanks. She simply acted, as though Elise had passed a torch directly into her hands. I sometimes wondered if Clara's feelings for Daniel were changing. There were moments when her eyes lingered on him, a heartbeat too long, when her voice softened just slightly in his presence. It was not the affection of a sister. It never had been. It was something more complex, born out of respect, empathy, and the strange alchemy of two people surviving grief together. I did not judge it, nor did I encourage it. I only watched, knowing that time and truth would reveal whatever path lay ahead. Through it all, Nora remained at the center. She began to draw family portraits again, and sometimes Clara appeared in them, standing beside me holding Nora's hand. It was as though the child had chosen her place in the family long before the rest of us dared to name it. Looking back, I see those years as a fragile bridge between what we lost and what we were becoming. Daniel was adrift, Clara was steady, and I was the watchful keeper of promises made to Elise. None of us knew what storms lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Clara's presence was no accident. She was the quiet anchor that kept us from breaking apart entirely. The first time Selena stepped through the doorway of my home, the air itself seemed to tighten. It was a Saturday evening in early autumn, the kind where the trees in Vermont blazed with red and gold outside, their colors reflecting in the windows. I had set the dining table carefully, hoping for a meal that would feel welcoming. Roast chicken, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, dishes Elise used to make, dishes I thought might put Nora at ease. Yet the moment Selena entered, draped in a cream-colored coat and carrying a smile polished to perfection, I sensed that this dinner would not be about comfort. It would be about performance. Daniel followed close behind her, carrying a bottle of wine and looking slightly more relaxed than I had seen him in months. His eyes sparkled with something close to pride, as if presenting Selena to us was a triumph, a promise that life was moving forward. "Mom," he said warmly, kissing my cheek, "thank you for hosting. This is important to me." Selena stepped forward with a graceful tilt of her head. "Mrs. Harper," she said in a voice smooth as silk, "I've heard so much about you. Your home is beautiful." She placed her coat over the chair as though she were accustomed to being waited on, her hands delicate, her perfume faint but sharp. I thanked her politely, watching how her eyes traveled around the room. They lingered on the family photographs along the mantel, pictures of Daniel and Elise, of little Nora holding up finger-painted masterpieces, of Clara and me at the library fundraiser. Selena's smile never wavered, but I noticed the faint narrowing of her eyes when they paused on Elise's photograph, the one framed in silver. She turned quickly back to Daniel, her hand slipping into his as if to reassert her place. Nora had been sitting quietly at the table, her red yarn doll pressed tightly against her chest. She wore a pale dress and white socks, her hair brushed smooth, though no ribbon could tame her unease. When Daniel introduced Selena, saying, "Nora, this is someone very special to me," the child's eyes dropped to her plate. Selena leaned toward her with a rehearsed sweetness. "Hello, darling," she cooed. "I brought you a little treat." From her purse, she produced a small wrapped candy and set it in front of Nora. Nora shook her head, clutching her doll tighter. "No, thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Selena's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Of course. Maybe later." Her hand brushed the candy aside, but I caught the sharp glint in her eyes before she turned back to Daniel. Clara, sitting beside Nora, gently slid the plate of bread closer. "Nora, would you like some with butter?" she asked softly. Nora nodded and took a small piece, her hand still trembling. Clara's calm presence filled the silence Selena had left, wrapping it in quiet assurance. Dinner began with forced pleasantries. Daniel spoke about work, about the new clients he was managing, about the trips he would need to take in the coming months. Selena chimed in with polished anecdotes about galas she had attended, the charities she supported, and the books she had read cover to cover. I listened politely, nodding when required, though I noticed how her stories always circled back to admiration, how others admired her, how she admired herself. Every so often I caught Clara's eyes across the table. She said little, but her gaze shifted often to Nora, watching her chew each bite slowly, watching her lips press together when Selena's hand brushed Daniel's. Clara seemed to understand the silent language of the child's unease, even if Daniel remained blind to it. At one point, Selena asked about Elise. "She must have been remarkable," she said, her voice low and sympathetic. The room grew still. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. I studied Selena's expression. It was perfectly measured, yet I felt... The question was not born from genuine curiosity, but from a need to compare herself. "She was," I answered firmly. "Elise was remarkable. She loved deeply, and she made this house a home." My words hung in the air like an unspoken boundary. Selena smiled politely, but her eyes cooled for just a moment. The meal continued, though the warmth I had hoped for never arrived. I noticed how Selena's compliments landed like drops of oil on water, sliding across the surface without ever soaking in. "This bread is delightful, Mrs. Harper. Did you bake it yourself? These flowers, are they from your garden?" Each remark was elegant yet distant, as though recited from a script. Nora remained quiet through most of the evening, eating only when Clara gently encouraged her. Several times I saw her press her face into the yarn doll, her small shoulders stiff. When Selena reached to pat her hand, Nora drew back sharply, shaking her head. Daniel chuckled lightly, trying to smooth over the awkwardness, but the discomfort did not disappear. It only deepened, like a shadow spreading across the room. After dessert, while Daniel poured wine for the adults, Selena excused herself to make a phone call in the hallway. The moment she left, Nora whispered urgently to Clara, "I don't like her." Clara stroked her hair, glancing at me with quiet concern. I leaned across the table and whispered back, "It's all right, sweetheart, you don't have to." When Selena returned, her smile was once again firmly in place. She took Daniel's arm as if to anchor herself there, presenting the image of unity, of perfection. To anyone else, she might have seemed like the flawless bride-to-be, gracious and composed. But I had seen too many human stories in my years at the library to be fooled by appearances. Books teach you that villains rarely show themselves in the first chapter. They appear in whispers, in glances, in the unease of children who sense danger before the rest of us dare to see it. That night, as I cleared the dishes and watched Nora cling to her doll, I understood that our lives were shifting. Selena had entered, bringing charm for the world and unease for the child who mattered most. And while Daniel seemed blinded by the promise of a new beginning, I felt the first chill of a storm approaching. The weeks after that dinner brought a series of moments that I could not ignore, each small in itself, but together, forming a pattern I recognized all too well from years of reading between the lines. Trouble rarely announces itself loudly at first. It creeps in, disguised as accidents or slips of the tongue, until suddenly you can no longer pretend it is not there. Daniel was eager for Selena and Nora to spend time together, insisting that it would help them bond. "She just needs a chance, Mom," he told me one morning on the phone. "Selena is trying." His voice carried that mixture of hope and impatience I knew well. He wanted harmony, so badly that he was willing to close his eyes to anything else. One Saturday, Selena offered to take Nora to the park. Daniel called me later saying, "It went well. Nora had a great time." But when I asked Nora that evening, her answer was silence. She sat at my kitchen table, drawing circles in crayon, the red yarn doll balanced beside her. Finally, she said softly, "I don't want to go with her again." Her words were so quiet that I almost missed them. When I pressed gently, she shook her head and added, "She yells." I froze. "She yelled at you?" Nora nodded, eyes fixed on the paper. She said, "Stop acting like a baby." I wanted to believe she had misunderstood, but the tone of her small voice carried the weight of truth. Later, when I asked Daniel, he looked tired, almost irritated. "She's exaggerating. Kids do that. Selena said they had fun. They got ice cream, Mom." He sighed, brushing the matter aside, unwilling to question the woman who now filled his life. But I knew my granddaughter, and I trusted her instincts more than his denial. Another evening, I stopped by Daniel's house, unannounced. Clara had gone ahead to drop off a casserole, and when I arrived, I found her standing in the kitchen with Nora, quietly washing dishes while the girl hummed a tune. Selena entered the room, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. Her smile appeared when she saw me, but before it did, I caught the flash of irritation in her eyes at finding Clara there. "Oh," she said smoothly, "I didn't expect company tonight." Clara explained gently that she was only helping. Selena's reply was sugar-coated. "Of course, you're such a dear." Yet the edge beneath the words was unmistakable. Clara kept her gaze lowered, but I could see she had felt the sting. Nora clung to her skirt, avoiding Selena's eyes altogether. It was in these small details that the truth revealed itself. I watched the way Selena's hand tightened on Daniel's arm at gatherings, the way she praised him in public while rolling her eyes in private. I noticed how Nora grew quieter, more withdrawn whenever Selena entered the room. At school, Mrs. Parker pulled me aside one afternoon. "Nora seems unsettled," she told me gently. "She used to laugh during reading time, but now she sits apart. Has something changed at home?" I felt my throat tighten as I thanked her for her concern, promising I would look into it. That night, I held Nora close as she drifted off to sleep in my house. She clutched her doll and whispered, "Grandma, please don't make me go back there." Her plea was not dramatic. It was weary, like the voice of someone older than her years. I brushed her hair back and kissed her forehead, my heart aching with the weight of promises made long ago to Elise. I wanted to believe Daniel would open his eyes on his own. I wanted to believe love would reveal itself clearly, that he would see the difference between genuine care and rehearsed charm. But hope is not the same as safety. Each sign pointed to a danger that was growing, and each day, Nora's silence became louder than any accusation I could make. The turning point came one evening when I visited for dinner again. Selena served pasta, her smile wide, her conversation lively. Daniel seemed content, sipping wine and recounting stories from work. At one point, Selena leaned toward Nora, offering a forkful. "Eat up, sweetheart," she said sweetly. Nora shook her head. Selena's smile faltered, and under her breath, barely loud enough for me to hear, she muttered, "Ungrateful child." My breath caught, though Daniel heard nothing. Clara stiffened across the table, her eyes snapping to mine. In that single moment, I knew we shared the same certainty. Beneath Selena's polished exterior lurked a coldness sharp enough to wound a child. After that night, I stopped trying to convince myself otherwise. One sign might be explained away. Two could be coincidence. But a chain of signs, each linked to the next, cannot be ignored. I began keeping notes in the back of my journal. The dates, the incidents, the things Nora said when she thought no one was listening. It was a librarian's instinct cataloging evidence quietly, preparing for the day when the truth would have to stand on its own. And as I wrote, I remembered Elise's voice in the garden, her plea that I keep her daughter safe. Each mark of my pen was an answer to that plea, a promise renewed. The storm was coming closer, and I would be ready to face it, even if Daniel was not. Nora's 7th birthday arrived with the soft glow of candles and the quiet hum of family voices gathered in my living room. I wanted to give her a day that felt safe, a day when laughter was not forced and where the shadow of loss did not linger too heavily. Clara had taken the lead, as she always did, planning every detail with a devotion that never asked for thanks. She baked the cake herself, a simple chocolate sponge with frosting swirled by hand, decorated with tiny paper butterflies Nora had cut and placed herself. The smell of it filled the house, sweet and warm, carrying with it the memory of Elise, who once believed birthdays should be marked not with grandeur, but with intimacy. The table was covered in bright cloth, balloons tied at each corner, and small presents stacked neatly to the side. Nora wore a pale yellow dress, her red yarn doll sitting proudly beside her plate as if it too were a guest of honor. Clara had made paper crowns, and to my surprise, Nora insisted we all wear them. She placed one on my head, another on Clara's, and finally settled one crookedly on her own before giggling at how silly we looked. That giggle was the first unguarded sound I had heard from her in weeks. Daniel arrived late, carrying a box wrapped in glossy paper. He kissed Nora's cheek, wished her happy birthday, and looked around as if apologizing for his absence. His eyes lingered briefly on Clara, then softened when they met mine. For a moment I saw the boy he once was, the one Elise had loved so deeply. Behind him, Selina entered with her usual poise. She carried no gift in her hands, though she offered compliments about the decorations and the cake, her smile stretched as though painted on. She stood slightly apart, her posture elegant but detached, observing rather than joining. When it came time for the cake, Clara lit the candles and we all sang. Nora's eyes shone in the candlelight, her small hands clasped together. As the song ended, she squeezed her eyes shut, whispered a wish we could not hear, and blew the candles out in one strong breath. Smoke curled into the air, and I prayed silently that her wish was for peace. After cake, Nora hurried to the corner where her crayons and paper waited. Clara followed, kneeling beside her as she bent to draw. Selina stayed behind, sipping a glass of sparkling cider, her gaze cool. Daniel busied himself gathering plates, trying to bridge the distance he felt but could not name. Nora drew with an intensity rare for her age, her crayon strokes deliberate and sure. She spoke little, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Clara leaned close, murmuring encouragements, her hand resting lightly on the child's back. I watched from the armchair, letting the scene unfold, sensing that something important was forming in those lines of wax and paper. When Nora finished, she lifted the drawing high with both hands, her face glowing with pride. "Grandma! Aunt Clara, look!" she cried. We gathered around her, and she held the paper out for us to see. The picture was simple yet powerful. 3 figures standing together under a blue sky. One was tall with gray hair, that was me. One was smaller with brown curls, that was Nora herself. And one was Clara, drawn with a long dress and a smile that stretched wide. There was no 4th figure, no Daniel, no Selina. Nora pressed the drawing against my chest, then against Clara's, her voice clear. "This is my family," she said softly but firmly, as if declaring a truth that could not be denied. A silence followed, heavy and unspoken. Daniel, standing with a plate in his hand, froze as the words reached him. His face flickered with something between guilt and pain. Selena's smile cracked for the first time that evening, her eyes narrowing just enough for me to see. She quickly looked away, pretending to admire the flowers on the table, but her grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. Clara, touched beyond words, bent down and hugged Nora gently. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Her eyes shimmered as she pressed a kiss to the child's hair. I placed my hand over both of them, feeling Elise's presence in that moment, as if she too were leaning close, approving of the bond forming so naturally. It was a simple drawing, nothing more than crayons on paper, yet it carried the weight of truth that children speak without hesitation. Nora had named the love she trusted, the people she felt safe with. The absence of others in that picture was not an accident. It was a declaration. As the evening wound down, Nora pinned the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a butterfly. Each time I passed it that night, I felt its quiet power. It was not a rejection shouted in anger, but a gentle unveiling of what she longed for most, a family built not on appearances but on sincerity. Later, when the guests had gone and the house fell quiet, I found Daniel standing in front of the refrigerator, staring at the picture. His shoulders were tense, his eyes shadowed. He reached out once, as if to remove it, but then pulled his hand back. Instead, he sighed deeply and turned away, leaving the drawing where it was. Clara, from the doorway, had seen the same. Our eyes met, and without words, we knew this small piece of paper had spoken louder than either of us ever could. The morning after Nora's birthday, I walked her to school. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of leaves scattered across the sidewalk. Nora held my hand tightly, her yarn doll tucked under her arm, as always, the drawing from the party still fresh in my mind. She had pinned her truth to the refrigerator without hesitation. Children rarely disguise their feelings. They speak them with crayons and whispers, and it is up to us to listen. That afternoon, when I returned to pick her up, her teacher, Mrs. Parker, asked if she could have a word with me. She was a gentle woman in her 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. We stood just outside the classroom, while the other children spilled into the hallway. Mrs. Parker lowered her voice, careful not to alarm Nora. "Mrs. Harper," she began, "I've noticed a change in Nora. She used to be one of the more cheerful children in class, always eager to share her stories. Lately, she seems withdrawn. She sits alone at recess, and sometimes she doesn't answer when I call her name. Yesterday, she refused to participate in group reading. I asked if something was wrong at home, and she wouldn't say, but her eyes—" She paused, searching for the right word. Her eyes looked frightened. The weight of those words pressed into me. I thanked Mrs. Parker, assuring her I would speak with Nora. My heart ached as I watched my granddaughter walk toward me, her backpack bouncing lightly with each step. She smiled faintly when she saw me, but I could tell it was the kind of smile children put on when they are trying to be brave. That evening, after dinner at my house, I found her sitting on the living room rug, sketching quietly. Clara had gone into the kitchen to clean up, humming a tune as she washed the dishes. I knelt beside Nora, stroking her hair gently. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "your teacher told me you've been quiet at school. Is something troubling you?" Nora froze, her crayon hovering over the paper. She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me. Her lips parted, then closed again, as if the words were caught in her throat. I touched her hand, waiting. Finally, in a trembling whisper, she said, "I don't want to go back to Daddy's house." My breath caught. I had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken out loud pierced me. "Why not, darling?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over as she clutched her doll. "Because she's there," she sobbed. "Selena. She doesn't like me. She tells me I ruin everything. She said if I wasn't here, Daddy would be happy." I felt a rush of cold fury and sorrow, though I kept my face calm for Nora's sake. My arms wrapped around her, holding her tightly as she cried into my shoulder. "Oh, my love," I murmured, "none of that is true. You are the light of this family. You are the reason your daddy smiles at all." Clara came in quietly, her hands still damp from the sink. She knelt on the other side of Nora, gently wiping her tears. "Sweetheart, you are perfect just the way you are," she whispered. "Don't ever believe anyone who tells you otherwise." Nora clung to both of us, her sobs slowing into hiccups. When she finally pulled back, she looked at me with solemn eyes. "Grandma, please don't make me go back there, please." I smoothed her hair and kissed her forehead. "I promise you, I will do everything I can to keep you safe." My voice trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the gravity of what I had just spoken. Later that night, after Nora had fallen asleep in Clara's bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my journal. I wrote down her words exactly as she had said them, every syllable etched into the page. I noted Mrs. Parker's concerns, the birthday drawing, the whispered confession. I cataloged it all, just as I had cataloged books for years, not because I doubted her, but because I knew that one day evidence would matter. Clara joined me quietly, her hair loose around her shoulders. She sat across from me, her expression heavy. "I've seen it too," she admitted. "The way Selena looks at her when no one's watching. It's cold. Like she's annoyed Nora even exists." Her voice shook with anger she struggled to contain. "Nora doesn't deserve that. Not after losing Elise." "No," I agreed, closing the journal with a firm hand. "She doesn't. And I will not stand by and let her be made to feel unwanted in her own father's home." Silence settled between us, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling outside the window. I reached for Clara's hand, grateful for her presence. She was more than a daughter to me. She was a shield for Nora, as devoted as if the child were her own. Together, we formed a circle around the girl Elise had left behind, a circle Selena could not break. As I finally rose to turn off the kitchen light, I looked back toward the bedroom where Nora slept, her doll clutched tightly in her arms. I whispered a promise into the darkened hallway, a promise Elise would have wanted me to keep. I will protect her, always. The evening of the wedding dinner arrived wrapped in glittering spectacle. The reception hall was transformed once again, its chandeliers glowing above tables, lined with crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Guests buzzed with laughter, toasts rang out, and Daniel looked happier than I had seen him in years. He stood beside Selena at the head table, his arm resting proudly around her chair. To anyone watching from the outside, they were the perfect pair. A man reborn through love, a bride radiant in her new role. But my eyes drifted to Nora, who sat quietly beside me at our table. She wore a soft dress of pale pink, her curls pinned back with a clip Clara had given her. The red yarn doll rested against her lap, its button eyes staring up as though it too sensed the unease in the room. Nora tapped her fingers nervously on her napkin, her gaze flitting to the platters that waiters carried past. When the first course arrived, I felt my heart stop for a beat. On each plate lay a row of shrimp, pink and gleaming under the lights, resting on a bed of greens. The scent reached my nose and immediately set me on edge. Nora stiffened in her chair, pushing her plate slightly away. I reached for her hand under the table, squeezing gently. I had always kept her allergy card in my purse, a habit born of vigilance and love. Elise had trained me well in those early years, reminding me never to leave home without it. "Just in case," she used to say, and I had never failed her. Tonight, with that card in my bag, I felt the old instinct flare to life. Daniel raised his glass to speak, his voice carrying across the hall. "To love that finds us again, even when we believe it has been lost," he declared. Guests cheered, glasses clinked, and all eyes turned toward him. But my eyes stayed fixed on Nora. Her small face tightened with discomfort as she looked down at the plate in front of her. She picked up her fork, then set it down again, her lips pressed together. Selena leaned across Daniel with a smile that seemed too wide. "Nora, darling," she called sweetly, "don't you want to try just a little? It's delicious." Nora shook her head quickly, pulling the doll closer. "No," she whispered, her voice so soft it nearly vanished under the laughter around us. Selena's eyes flickered for a second, a sharp glance that betrayed irritation before her smile returned for the crowd. Daniel chuckled, dismissing the tension. "She's picky, that's all," he said, turning back to his conversation. But I saw more than pickiness. I saw fear. The waiters moved briskly, refilling glasses and setting down baskets of bread. I caught sight of one of them, a young man named Ethan who had helped during Nora's birthday party at my house. He gave me a brief nod, a polite smile, before disappearing toward the kitchen with a tray. Clara sat across from Nora, her gaze attentive. When she noticed the untouched plate, she leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "It's all right, sweetheart. You don't have to eat it." Nora's shoulders relaxed slightly, reassured by Clara's steady presence. Around us, conversation swelled. Guests praised Selena's elegance, the beauty of the hall, the success of the union. To them, it was an evening of joy. But to me, the air felt heavy, as if danger had taken a seat at our table. Nora pressed her doll into her chest and leaned close to me. "Grandma," she whispered, "please don't let me eat it." Her wide brown eyes brimmed with urgency, and my throat tightened at the trust she placed in me. "You won't," I assured her, "not as long as I'm here." I slid the plate slightly farther from her reach, replacing it with a piece of bread and butter. She nibbled quietly, keeping her gaze low, her fingers still gripping the doll's soft yarn body. The music swelled again, violins filling the hall. Couples rose to dance, skirts twirling under the golden light. Daniel led Selena onto the floor, his face glowing, hers gleaming with satisfaction. Guests clapped as they moved gracefully, the picture of unity. Yet from where I sat, the scene felt like a play staged for applause, while beneath the surface, a darker story unfolded. I looked at Nora, then at Clara, and I saw in their eyes what my own heart already knew. Something was terribly wrong. The shrimp on the plate was not just food. It was a threat disguised as hospitality, a danger that brushed too close to the little girl I had sworn to protect. As the song ended and the dancers bowed, a burst of applause filled the hall. But beneath the table, my hand closed tightly around Nora's, grounding her, grounding myself. Her fear was real, her instincts true. The glittering joy of the wedding dinner could not disguise the chill that settled deep in my bones. I knew then that the night was only beginning and that I would need to look deeper, to bend low and see what lay hidden beneath the tablecloth of appearances. For in that place, under the fabric of celebration, the truth was waiting to be found. The clinking of glasses and the rise of laughter carried across the ballroom as though nothing in the world could touch the joy of that evening. Daniel and Selena stood together at the center of it all, glowing beneath the chandeliers, their smiles painted for every guest to admire. To anyone else, the dinner was perfect. But under the polished surface, danger had been quietly laid, waiting for the one person most vulnerable. Nora sat beside me, her pink dress pressed neatly, her small hands curled tightly around the yarn doll in her lap. She had pushed her plate away, eyes fixed on the polished silverware, refusing to eat. I leaned closer, smoothing her hair back, whispering that she was safe. But I felt her tremble against me, and I knew her unease was more than childish nerves. A waiter passed, collecting dishes. His tray tipped slightly, and a folded piece of paper slipped from it, fluttering to the floor. At first I thought it nothing more than a scrap. But the way Nora's hand clamped down on my sleeve, her eyes widening with dread, stopped me cold. She whispered with the same broken urgency I had heard that night beneath the wedding table. "Grandma, look under." The guests around us laughed at a toast, their attention elsewhere. I slid my shawl from my shoulders, letting it fall so I had reason to bend. Slowly, carefully, I leaned down, lifting the long linen tablecloth. My knees brushed the carpet as I reached under, my fingers searching for the slip of paper that had landed in the shadows. When I found it, my hand froze. It was not a discarded note of seating arrangements or a menu. It was a kitchen order slip marked in bold type, Table 8, Child's Plate, and in sharp handwriting added across the bottom, darker than the print itself, were the words, "Add shrimp." My chest tightened, my breath caught. I read it twice, 3 times, hoping my eyes had deceived me. But the letters were clear, deliberate, undeniable. Someone had ordered shrimp to be placed onto Nora's meal, not a mistake, not an accident, an instruction. I kept the slip clutched in my palm, my hand trembling against my skirt. My mind raced through every possibility, but the truth was already glaring. Nora's allergy was not unknown. Everyone close to her knew it. Elise had carried that card for years, and I had taken it into my purse the day her mother was buried. I carried it still, even now, resting in the lining of my bag at my feet. To see it disregarded here, no, more than disregarded, targeted, sent a wave of icy clarity through me. I lowered the cloth and sat back upright, pressing Nora close to me. She looked at my face and knew, without my saying a word, that her instincts had been right. The doll slipped from her lap, tumbling to the carpet, landing half beneath the cloth, its red yarn hair brushing the edge of my shoe. I did not reach to pick it up immediately. My eyes stayed fixed on the slip in my hand, its message burning like fire. The music swelled again and applause filled the air as Daniel raised his glass for another toast. He spoke of beginnings, of gratitude, of second chances. Selena glowed beside him, her hand sliding down his arm, her eyes sweeping across the crowd as if soaking in their approval. She looked toward our table, smiling faintly at Nora as if to remind the child of her presence, her dominance. And all the while, the slip of paper burned in my palm like proof of a secret act hidden beneath a veil of celebration. Clara leaned closer, sensing something in my face. "What is it?" she whispered. I shook my head, slipping the note quietly into my purse. "Later," I mouthed. Her eyes narrowed, but she trusted me, enough not to press further in that moment. She shifted her chair slightly closer to Nora, placing her hand gently on the child's back, anchoring her. I forced myself to remain composed. I smiled politely when guests passed by, accepted compliments about the decorations, even lifted my glass when Daniel looked my way. But every movement felt heavy, every word felt hollow. All I could see was the instruction written in that careless hand, the attempt to turn celebration into tragedy. Beneath the table, I reached again for Nora's fallen doll, lifting it into her lap. She clutched it tight, her small chin lifting as if she, too, understood the gravity of what had nearly happened. The innocence in her face mixed with something deeper, the quiet knowledge of a child who had learned too soon that not everyone who smiles means well. I could not confront it there, not yet. To shout in the middle of the ballroom would have caused chaos, disbelief, excuses. I needed clarity. I needed proof stronger than one piece of paper slipped from a waiter's tray. But inside me, a fire lit that would not go out. Elise's voice echoed in memory, her plea in the garden, her trust in me. Keep her safe. And I knew then that this wedding, this glittering hall, was not a beginning. It was a battlefield cloaked in flowers and music. The chandeliers sparkled, the dancers twirled, and to the rest of the world the evening went on without interruption. But for me, everything had changed. Beneath the table, hidden from the gaze of 100 guests, I had uncovered a secret that threatened the very child Elise had entrusted to me. I tucked the slip deeper into my purse, my fingers brushing the allergy card I always kept there. Together they formed a story that only I yet knew, a story that would soon demand to be told. As the last toast ended and laughter rippled across the hall, I bent to whisper in Nora's ear, "You're safe, my love. I promise." She nodded, pressing her doll close, her trust resting wholly on me. And I knew, with a certainty as sharp as the note I carried that the fight for her safety had only just begun. The ballroom was still alive with chatter and music when I excused myself quietly, keeping my purse clutched tight against my side. Inside, it lay the slip of paper, its message seared into my mind. I needed to know more. One note alone could be dismissed as an accident, but the instinct that had carried me through decades as a librarian told me otherwise. This was a trail, and trails always led somewhere if you followed patiently. I found Ethan near the service corridor, a tall young man with kind eyes who had worked the Harper events before. He was balancing a tray of glasses when I touched his arm. He startled slightly, then smiled with recognition. "Mrs. Harper, can I help you?" I lowered my voice. "I need a word. Privately, please." He hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where other waiters moved in and out, then nodded. "Give me a moment." He set the tray aside and led me through a narrow hallway lined with stacked chairs and boxes of linens. The muffled music from the ballroom followed us faintly, but here the air was quieter, sharper, and more honest. I withdrew the slip of paper from my purse, unfolding it with deliberate care. "This fell near my table," I said softly. "Do you recognize it?" Ethan's eyes landed on the words, and I watched the color drain from his face. His hand rose to rub the back of his neck. That's one of ours. It's an order slip from the kitchen printer. Table 8, your table." I held his gaze. "And the handwriting?" He swallowed hard. "That's not standard. The printed orders come straight from the system. Any handwriting added, that's someone giving extra instructions." My heart tightened. "And who would have handed this to you?" He shifted on his feet, his voice low. "I shouldn't even say, but it came from a guest, a woman. She slipped it to me when I was near the table." "Do you remember her face?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, she was dressed elegantly. Dark hair, pulled back, pretty. She looked like she belonged." He paused, lowering his voice further. "I still have the printed slip in the kitchen, the original. I kept it because the handwriting looked off to me. I wasn't sure if it was a joke or serious, but seeing your face right now, I know it wasn't a joke." My pulse raced, though I kept my tone even. "Please show me." He disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a folded sheet. The order line was identical. Table 8, child's plate. No mention of shrimp, but across the bottom, in the same dark pen, was the scrawled instruction, "Add shrimp." The handwriting matched the slip I held in my purse. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. Here was proof. Not speculation, not imagination, but evidence. 2 slips, 1 clean, 1 poisoned with ink. My librarian's instinct cataloged every detail, the smudge of the pen, the uneven curl of the letters, the faint indentation pressed into the paper. Ethan looked uneasy. "Mrs. Harper, I don't want to get in trouble. If anyone finds out I showed you this..." I touched his arm gently. "You did the right thing. You may have saved a child tonight." His shoulders eased, though his eyes remained clouded with worry. "Should I tell the manager?" "Not yet," I said firmly. "Let me handle it for now, but keep the original slip safe. It may be needed." He nodded, folding it carefully back into his pocket. "I'll keep it. I don't want anything bad happening to that little girl. She's too sweet." The sincerity in his voice made my throat ache. I thanked him and returned to the ballroom, my steps slower, my mind sharper. The chandeliers glittered as before. The music played on, and Selena's laughter floated across the room like glass bells. To the guests, nothing had changed, but to me, everything had. I slid back into my seat beside Nora and Clara. Nora immediately leaned into me, her doll pressed between us. I placed a hand on her small back, my other hand resting protectively on my purse. Clara studied my face, her brow furrowing. "You found something," she whispered. "Yes," I murmured, my voice steady though my chest felt heavy. "And it confirms what we feared." Her eyes darkened, but she nodded. "Then we'll stand together." I looked across the hall at Daniel, who was laughing with a guest, oblivious to the danger swirling so close. He wanted so much to believe in a second chance that he could not see the cracks forming beneath his own feet. My heart ached for him, but my resolve hardened for Nora. The slip of paper burned like truth in my bag, undeniable and unforgiving. Elise's voice echoed once again in memory. "Promise me, you'll keep her safe." And in that ballroom, beneath chandeliers and polite applause, I silently vowed again, I will keep her safe, no matter what storm I must face. The evening continued, but I no longer heard the laughter or the music. My ears listened only for danger, my eyes scanning every corner. What had begun as a celebration had become an investigation, and I was its unwilling detective. The proof was in my hands now, and soon the mask that charmed the crowd would have to fall. The night did not ease after I returned to the ballroom. If anything, the air felt heavier, as though the chandeliers themselves pressed down on us. I had the order slip tucked safely in my purse, but my instincts told me there was still more beneath the surface. It was Clara who noticed the odd detail first. She leaned closer, her eyes sharp. "Look at Nora's place card," she whispered. I glanced down. The card perched neatly above her plate read N. Harper, written in the same elegant script as the rest. But Clara shook her head. "That's not the card I saw when we sat down. It looked different, shorter, with a different flourish on the H." I frowned. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Clara insisted. I helped Nora into her seat. Someone switched it. The thought chilled me. Why would anyone bother tampering with something as simple as a seating card unless they meant to create confusion? I slipped the card discreetly into my bag. "We'll compare it later," I murmured. During a pause in the music, I excused myself once more and headed toward the kitchen corridor. Ethan was there again, collecting another tray. I showed him the card quickly, my hand shielding it from passing eyes. "Does this look altered to you?" He studied it briefly, his brow furrowed. "The paper stock is the same, but the ink is slightly different. Ours are printed by machine, not handwritten. If this was swapped, someone must have brought an extra." The pieces did not fit neatly. If the plan had been only to add shrimp to Nora's plate, why change the card? Unless the goal was to place her somewhere else entirely, perhaps closer to someone in the catering line who could carry out instructions unnoticed. "Could it have been a mistake?" I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew the answer. Ethan shook his head. "It's too deliberate. We log seating cards carefully. If one was swapped, someone wanted her in a specific spot." I thanked him and slipped the card back into my purse with the slip of paper. Two objects now sat side by side, whispering of danger. Both pointed to planning, to intent, yet still the figure behind it remained hidden in shadows. When I returned, Clara's eyes searched mine. "Well?" "It may be nothing," I said carefully, not wishing to alarm Nora, "but we'll hold on to it." Across the hall, Selena laughed with a cluster of guests, her gown shimmering in the light. She looked every bit the flawless bride, her posture elegant, her charm intact. But I remembered the flicker in her eyes at Nora's birthday, the muttered words at dinner, the way her smile sharpened when the child recoiled. I watched her now, wondering if she knew I carried evidence in my purse, wondering if her mask would hold once the truth was revealed. Daniel caught my gaze briefly, raising his glass toward me with a smile. I forced one back, my heart heavy. He was blind to the web tightening around his daughter, eager to believe the picture of perfection painted before him. It hurt to see, but I also understood grief makes us reach for whatever promises safety, even if those promises are hollow. Nora tugged my sleeve gently. "Grandma," she whispered, "why is my name card in your bag?" I stroked her hair. "Because sometimes people make mistakes, sweetheart, and I like to keep things safe." She seemed satisfied with the answer, clutching her doll once more. The orchestra struck up another song, couples rising to dance. Laughter echoed, champagne sparkled, and the evening unfolded as though nothing lay beneath its sheen. Yet beneath the table, my fingers brushed against the card and the slip in my purse. They felt like anchors, proof that appearances could not be trusted. Later, as the plates were cleared and dessert prepared, I excused myself briefly to the powder room. In the mirror, I studied my own reflection. A woman of 65, hair streaked with gray, eyes lined by years of both books and sorrows. I looked tired, but behind the fatigue burned determination. Elise's voice still rang in memory. Keep her safe. I had not faltered yet, and I would not now. The false lead of the card might distract some, pointing suspicion toward a careless caterer or a misprint, but I knew better. I could feel the pattern forming, a deliberate chain leading toward the truth. Whoever had orchestrated this had underestimated a librarian's eye for detail and a grandmother's instinct for protection. When I returned, Nora had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder, her doll tucked under, her chin. Clara met my eyes, her expression steady. We both knew this was not over. The night still had revelations waiting, and the mask of joy would not last forever. The orchestra played its last lively note as the dessert plates were set down, and a hush of contentment fell over the ballroom. Glasses clinked, laughter rolled like a tide, and the chandeliers cast a golden glow on the polished floor. To the guests, it was an evening of triumph, a union to be celebrated. To me, it had become a theater of danger and deception. I could feel the weight of the two objects in my purse, the seating card and the order slip, pressing against the lining like stones. They were small things, fragile in appearance, but together they carried the power to shatter the image so carefully crafted before us. My heart beat heavily as I thought of Elise, as I thought of her plea that I keep her daughter safe. The moment to remain silent had ended. Daniel rose to give a final toast, his voice carried proudly, filled with the warmth of wine and the joy of being surrounded by family and friends. To new beginnings, he declared, raising his glass high, to love that endures, to family. Family. The word sliced through me. Nora shifted in her chair beside me, clutching her doll, her eyes darting toward her father with longing and unease. Clara's hand rested gently on her back, steady as a rock. Selena stood with her arm looped through Daniel's, her smile flawless, her poise unbroken. I pushed back my chair and stood. The sound of it scraping the floor drew heads toward me. My voice was not loud, but it carried. Years in the library had taught me that stillness commands more attention than shouting. Before this evening ends, I said calmly, there is something that must be addressed. A ripple of curiosity spread among the guests. Daniel's smile faltered. "Mom," he began, but I lifted my hand. "This note," I continued, withdrawing the folded slip from my purse, "was found beneath our table." I unfolded it slowly, the paper trembling only slightly in my fingers. It reads, Table 8, Child's Plate, and then written by hand, Add shrimp. Gasps rustled through the hall. Selena's face remained composed, but her grip on Daniel's arm tightened. "You all know my granddaughter's allergy," I said, my voice gaining strength. "A single bite could have taken her life tonight." I turned to Daniel, meeting his stunned eyes. This was no accident. Selena let out a laugh, sharp and brittle. "Surely you can't be serious. Notes fall on the floor all the time at events like this. It's absurd to suggest anything sinister." "Absurd?" My tone cut clean. "Then perhaps you can explain why Ethan, the waiter, still holds the original printed slip from the kitchen. Without handwriting, without shrimp. The order was tampered with, and someone here intended it." All eyes turned to the young waiter who stepped forward nervously, pulling the paper from his pocket. His voice shook, but he spoke the truth. "It's true, I received this from a woman. I didn't want to believe it, but now—" He glanced at Nora, his throat tightening. "Now I know." Daniel looked from Ethan to me, his face paling. "Mom, are you saying—" Selena cut in sharply, her smile gone. "This is madness. Your mother is confused. Old women see conspiracies in shadows. She's trying to ruin our evening." The words stung, but I held my ground. "Old women also keep records," I said softly. I withdrew the seating card from my purse and laid it on the table. This card was switched at Nora's place. The ink doesn't match the others. Ask yourself, Daniel, who benefits from confusing her seat, from slipping instructions to the kitchen, from silencing a child? The ballroom pulsed with whispers, eyes darting towards Selena. Her mask cracked further, her composure thinning under the weight of suspicion. Daniel's voice was strained. "Selena, did you—" "Of course not," she snapped, turning to him with practiced indignation. "Can't you see what's happening? Your mother and Clara have never accepted me. They've twisted this into some cruel drama." Clara rose then, her face pale but resolute. "Enough," she said clearly. Her voice was not loud, but the conviction in it rang like a bell. "I've watched you. I've seen how you look at Nora when you think no one notices. Cold, calculating. And I've heard the words you muttered under your breath when she wouldn't obey. You cannot gaslight us all into believing this is nothing. Tonight, you crossed a line." The hall erupted in murmurs. Guests shifted uneasily, some clutching their pearls, others whispering behind hands. Selena's eyes flared with fury, but before she could respond, Clara stepped closer. "You tried to make a child disappear in plain sight. That will never happen, not while we are here." Selena sneered, her mask finally gone. "You think anyone will believe the two of you? You're nothing but bitter women clinging to ghosts." And then, before I could stop her, Clara's hand rose and struck Selena across the face. The sound cracked through the hall like a whip. A collective gasp surged, followed by silence so complete I could hear the chandeliers hum above us. Selena's hand flew to her cheek, her eyes blazing. But she did not speak. She looked around at the faces now staring at her, not with admiration, but with doubt, with fear, with judgment. Daniel stood frozen, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. He stared at the note, at the seating card, at the red mark blooming on Selena's cheek. For the first time, I saw him truly look, not at the image of a perfect bride, but at the cracks she could no longer hide. I placed my arm around Nora, who pressed into me, her doll shielded tight against her chest. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. The truth has a way of showing itself, even in rooms filled with noise and glitter. Tonight, it speaks louder than any toast. The guests remained silent, watching, waiting. The performance of the evening had ended, and the curtain had lifted to reveal something raw and undeniable. The silence after Clara's hand met Selena's cheek stretched longer than any pause in music could. Guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, unsure whether to rise, to intervene, or to stay frozen in their seats. The chandeliers glowed mercilessly above us, throwing their light on every face, exposing every fracture in the glittering illusion. It was then, from near the edge of the hall, that a young voice broke through, trembling, hesitant, but clear enough to still the air. "Stop." All heads turned. Maya Ward, Selena's younger sister, stood just beyond the crowd. She was only 18, her dress too grown up for her age, her shoulders hunched as though she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her wide eyes darted between Selena, Daniel, and me. Her hands shook as she twisted the strap of her purse, her lips quivering as though the words she held inside had grown too heavy to contain. Selena's eyes flashed with alarm. "Maya!" she hissed, her voice low and warning. "Not now!" But Maya stepped forward, tears brimming. "No," she said, louder this time, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. "They deserve to know." Daniel's gaze fixed on her, confused, pleading for clarity. "Know what?" Maya's chest heaved. "It was Selena. She told me what to do. She made me switch the cards. She told me to slip the note." Her words tumbled out, broken by sobs. "I didn't want to, but she said it was the only way to make things right. She said Nora was in the way. The ballroom erupted. Gasps swept through the room like wind through dry leaves. Some guests rose to their feet. Others pressed their hands to their mouths, unable to look away. Selena lunged forward, her polished facade collapsing into fury. "You foolish girl, do you know what you're saying?" Her voice carried venom now, her composure shattered. She reached as though to grab her sister's arm, but Maya stepped back, clutching her purse like a shield. "I can't keep your secrets anymore," Maya cried. "I've watched you smile in front of everyone and whisper horrible things when no one's listening. I've seen the way you look at her." She pointed toward Nora, trembling in my arms. "Like she's a stain you want to erase. I thought maybe you were right, that Daniel deserved a clean slate. But then I saw Nora's face when you scolded her. I heard her crying in the bathroom. I can't be part of this anymore." Selena's lips curled into a sneer. "You think they'll believe you? You think anyone will take the word of a child over mine?" I rose, my hand still resting firmly on Nora's back. My voice was calm but sharp. "There are cameras in this venue, every hallway, every kitchen. If you believe your charm will outshine truth, then by all means, let us ask to see the footage." Selena froze. For the first time, true fear flickered in her eyes. Clara stood beside me, her posture unwavering. "Yes," she added, "let's check the cameras. If Maya is lying, the truth will clear you. If she's telling the truth—" Her words hung like a blade. The guests murmured, whispers rising into a wave of discontent. Selena looked around, realizing her once adoring audience had turned into a jury. Daniel's face drained of color as he stared at his bride, disbelief battling with dawning recognition. "Maya," he said hoarsely, "is this true?" Maya wept openly now, nodding. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do. She said it would be quick, that no one would notice. But I couldn't. I couldn't let Nora get hurt." The weight of her words pressed the room into silence again. Selena's chest rose and fell rapidly, her fury simmering just beneath her skin. She looked like a cornered animal desperate for escape. Daniel staggered back a step, running a hand through his hair. "Selena!" His voice cracked. "Tell me she's lying. Tell me this isn't who you are." Selena opened her mouth, but no words came. Only a bitter laugh slipped through, sharp and hollow. "You're pathetic," she spat at him finally. "So desperate for comfort you couldn't see what was in front of you. Did you really think I wanted to raise another woman's child?" The words cut through the hall, cruel and undeniable. Guests gasped, some stepping away from her as if the venom might spill over. Daniel's face crumpled, his eyes shutting against the blow. I felt Nora press her face into my shoulder, trembling. I stroked her hair, whispering softly, "You're safe, my love." Clara's hand found mine briefly, steadying me. Selena's mask had fallen completely, her contempt laid bare for all to see. Maya sobbed openly, clinging to the edge of a chair, but her truth had already shifted the tide. The guests no longer looked at Selena with admiration. They looked at her with horror. Daniel opened his eyes at last, his voice low but resolute. "Enough," he said. His hand trembled, but his tone held steel. "This ends tonight." And with that, the illusion of happiness shattered, leaving only truth standing under the chandeliers. The ballroom no longer pulsed with music. The orchestra had fallen silent, their bows frozen mid-air, as if the very strings of the violins refused to play for what had just been revealed. Guests stood in clusters, whispers spreading like cracks in a pane of glass. Selena stood rigid, her cheeks flushed with rage, her eyes darting wildly for an escape that no longer existed. Daniel's face was a portrait of devastation. His shoulders sagged, his hand trembling as he tried to steady himself on the back of a chair. He had spent months believing in the promise of renewal, of happiness rebuilt. Now, in front of his family and every guest, that promise had been exposed as hollow. Two men from the venue's security staff approached quietly, their black suits sharp against the golden light. One gestured towards Selena with a firm but professional tone. "Ma'am, we'll need you to step outside." She let out a sharp laugh, brittle and jagged. "You think you can escort me out like some criminal?" Her eyes swept across the room, desperate for allies, but found none. Even her sister stood apart, her face streaked with tears, unable to meet her gaze. Daniel straightened slowly, as though gathering strength from somewhere deep within. His voice cracked, but did not waver. "Selena, enough, go." For a heartbeat she glared at him, her lips curling with contempt. But the pressure of silence, the eyes, the evidence, the truth, pressed too heavily against her. She jerked her arm away from the guard's gentle hold, but allowed herself to be led across the room. The click of her heels against the polished floor echoed like nails driven into wood, final and unyielding. As she passed, her eyes met mine, cold, sharp, unrepentant. Yet beneath the fury, I thought I saw something else. The terror of a woman who had built her life on illusion and watched it crumble in one evening. She turned her face quickly away, her back rigid, as the guards escorted her through the tall double doors. They closed behind her with a heavy thud, and just like that, the performance of perfection ended. The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to applaud, to comfort, or to leave. Nora pressed into me, her yarn doll crushed between us. Clara's hand rested on her small back, a steady anchor in the storm. Daniel's knees seemed to give way, and he sank slowly until he was kneeling before Nora. His hands shook as he reached for her, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have protected you. I should have seen." Tears streaked his face, his grief laid bare before his daughter and the entire hall. Nora looked at him with wide, trembling eyes. She did not speak, but her tiny hand reached out, resting against his cheek with a tenderness that broke every heart in the room. Daniel closed his eyes, pressing her palm to his face, his shoulders shaking. Then, with a sudden clarity, he reached for his own hand and tugged at the gold band that had so recently been placed there. The wedding ring slid free, catching the chandelier's light before he set it down on the linen of the table. He placed it beside the damning slip of paper that had exposed the truth, a silent declaration that this marriage was over. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The gesture was simple, but its weight was enormous. In removing that ring, Daniel cut ties not only with Selena, but with the false happiness he had tried so desperately to build. The sound of the band resting on the table was quiet, yet it seemed to echo louder than any music had all evening. I felt tears burn in my own eyes. For years, I had watched my son drift further from the man Elise had loved, consumed by grief and blinded by the need to fill the void. Now, kneeling before his child, stripped of illusions, I saw a flicker of the Daniel I once knew. Broken, but honest. Clara moved closer, kneeling as well, her hand resting lightly on Nora's shoulder. Together they formed a fragile circle, father, daughter, and the woman who had become the quiet guardian between them. I remained standing, my hand resting on the back of Nora's chair, holding myself steady. Elise's presence felt so near in that moment, as if she were watching from just beyond the glow of the chandeliers, nodding silently. The guests began to stir, some moving toward the exits, others whispering to one another with shaken voices. No one raised a toast now, no one clapped for speeches. The celebration had been stripped bare, leaving only the raw truth of a family standing in its ashes. Daniel lifted Nora into his arms, holding her tightly as she clung to him. "No more pretending," he whispered. "No more masks. I promise you, never again." His words were not grand or polished. They were real, spoken from a heart cracked wide open. And as I watched him carry his daughter close, the ring left abandoned on the table, I knew the night had turned. What had begun as betrayal was now the painful first step toward healing. It was a step Daniel needed to take, even if it broke him. The days that followed the wedding did not carry the sound of violins or the glow of chandeliers. Instead, they brought quiet mornings and hushed evenings, spaces filled not with spectacle, but with the small, steady acts of care that breathe life back into broken hearts. Nora returned to my house, her world turned upside down, yet steadied by the familiar walls and the constant presence of Clara. Clara took to the rhythm naturally, as if she had been preparing for it her whole life. The first morning, she was already in the kitchen before the sun had risen, standing over the stove in her faded apron, carefully preparing a small lunchbox. Inside, she placed a sandwich cut into the shape of a star, a note folded neatly beside it. "You are loved, always." She added an apple, peeled and sliced, wrapped in parchment as Elise once did. When Nora came in, rubbing her sleepy eyes, Clara greeted her with a smile that reached every corner of the room. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, kneeling to help Nora slip into her shoes. "Today you're going to shine." Nora's smile was faint, but it was real. She tucked the yarn doll into her backpack and carried the lunchbox with both hands, as though it were a treasure chest. I watched them leave for school together, my heart aching with both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for what Nora had endured. Gratitude that she now had Clara to catch her every time the ground threatened to fall away. That afternoon, Clara and Nora went to the park. The wind was sharp, carrying the bite of early autumn, but Nora's laughter cut through it as she ran across the grass. Clara held the string of a small kite, its tail flickering like fire in the sky, before handing it to the girl. "It's yours now," she said, her voice steady. Nora gripped the spool, her giggles filling the air as the kite soared higher. I sat on the bench, Elise's memory beside me, and thought how healing often comes not with thunder, but with threads of ordinary joy. Another night, Nora woke crying with a fever, her cheeks flushed, her small body trembling under the blanket. Clara was there first, her hands cool against Nora's forehead, her voice steady as she hummed softly. She fetched the medicine, measured carefully, and coaxed Nora to sip water. She stayed by her side until the fever broke, whispering promises into the dark. I found myself standing at the door, unseen, watching the quiet devotion that spoke louder than vows. Daniel, too, began to notice. He came often, awkward at first, sitting on the edge of the living room chair as though unsure if he belonged. He watched Clara braid Nora's hair one evening, the child sitting cross-legged on the rug with crayons scattered around her. The braids were uneven, but Nora laughed, turning her head to admire them in the mirror. Daniel's eyes softened, wet with something he did not say. Later, he pulled me aside in the kitchen, his voice low. "I didn't realize how much she's done." "Clara. She's been here all along, hasn't she?" I nodded gently. "Yes. She chose Nora long before you noticed." His hand trembled as he lifted his glass of water. "I thought I was giving Nora stability with Selena. I thought appearances mattered more than small things, but it's the small things that have saved her." His voice cracked. "I failed her, Mom." "You failed yourself too," I said softly. "But failure isn't the end. It's the space where responsibility can begin." Over the next week, Daniel spent more time with us. He watched quietly as Clara folded tiny notes into lunchboxes, as she mended the torn seam of Nora's dress, as she sat cross-legged on the floor drawing houses with her. He said little, but I saw the dawning recognition in his face that love was not in the grand speeches of a ballroom, but in the daily acts of devotion that asked for nothing in return. One Sunday morning, we gathered at the kitchen table, the air filled with the smell of pancakes. Clara placed a plate in front of Nora with a smile, and Daniel sat across from them, his hand lingering near his daughter's, as if he still sought permission to belong. Nora giggled at the doll propped against her cup, then leaned into Clara's side. Daniel's eyes met mine. I saw shame there, still, but also hope. As the morning light streamed through the window, I felt something shift. The noise of the wedding had faded, leaving behind a fragile, tender quiet. And in that quiet, the family Elise had dreamed of was beginning to take shape, not through vows spoken under chandeliers, but through the steady work of love stitched together in kitchens, parks, and night watches. Healing rarely comes with applause. It arrives slowly, gently, in the hands of those who choose to stay. Clara had stayed. Nora had blossomed under her care. And Daniel, broken but willing, had begun to see. Daniel came to me one evening long after Nora had fallen asleep in Clara's room, the yarn doll tucked against her chest. He looked tired, the lines in his face deeper than ever, but there was a steadiness in his eyes I had not seen in years. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need to make things right, not just with Nora, but with everyone I failed." The next day, he asked me to come with him to the wedding venue. Together, we walked through the now empty hall that only days before had been filled with music and laughter. The chandeliers still glittered, but the air felt different, stripped of illusions. Daniel met with the manager, requesting access to the security footage. His voice shook as he explained, but he did not shy away from the truth. "Someone tried to harm my daughter," he said firmly. "I need to see everything. I need proof, not just for me, but for her." The manager agreed, his face grave. We sat in a small office while the recordings were pulled up. Camera after camera revealed fragments of that night. Selena whispering to Maya near the kitchen doors, Maya slipping a card onto the table, Selena's cold expression when Nora refused her plate. Each image was a mirror Daniel could no longer turn away from. He bowed his head into his hands, and for a long while, he didn't move. When he finally lifted his face, his eyes were red but clear. "I let myself be blinded," he admitted. "I wanted so badly to believe I was rebuilding my life that I ignored the cost. I ignored Nora." I reached across the table, resting my hand over his. "Awareness is the first step. What you do next is what matters." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll take every step needed." Later that week, he sat in the office of a family counselor, a woman with a calm, steady presence. He spoke honestly about his mistakes, about the hollow marriage, about the betrayal he had allowed into his home. She listened, then said simply, "Accountability is not about punishment. It's about choosing responsibility every day, even when it's uncomfortable." Daniel left the appointment with a list of commitments: regular counseling sessions for himself and Nora, honest communication, and clear safety rules in their home. For the first time, I felt the ground shift beneath him, not crumbling, but settling into something firm. I wrote about it in my journal that night. Elise would never see this moment, but I hoped she would feel it. Daniel was learning at last that fatherhood is not about perfection or appearance. It is about showing up again and again and owning the weight of one's choices. The following weekend, the house was quiet in the late afternoon. Clara sat on the floor with Nora, helping her piece together a puzzle of a farmhouse and orchard. Daniel watched from the armchair, his hands clasped, his expression soft but uncertain. When the final piece slid into place, Nora leaned against Clara, giggling. She turned suddenly, her small hand resting on Clara's cheek. Her voice was innocent, yet it carried the weight of something profound. "I want Aunt Clara to be my mommy." The room stilled. My breath caught, and Daniel's head lifted sharply. Clara froze, her eyes wide, then softened as she looked down at the little girl in her lap. "Sweetheart," she whispered gently, "you already have a mommy in heaven who loves you, and I'm just here to take care of you." But Nora shook her head, curls bouncing. "I know, but I want you to. You make me feel safe, like Mommy Elise." Her words tumbled out with the simple truth children carry. Daniel pressed a hand to his mouth, his shoulders shaking. He rose slowly, crossing the room until he stood before his daughter and Clara. He knelt, his tears falling freely. "Nora," he said hoarsely, "do you really feel that way?" She nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Daddy. Aunt Clara listens to me. She makes me lunch. She holds me when I'm sick. She doesn't get mad when I cry. I want her to be my mommy." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Daniel, then at me, her face caught between disbelief and love. "I never wanted to replace Elise," she whispered, "but I love her daughter with all my heart." Daniel reached for her hand, his voice breaking. "Maybe love doesn't replace. Maybe it expands." He turned to Nora, stroking her hair. "Your wish matters, sweetheart, more than anything else. If Clara is who makes you feel safe, then she is your family." I sat quietly, watching as my son finally understood what Elise had known all along, that love is not measured by appearances or vows, but by presence, by devotion, by the quiet sacrifices of daily life. Nora's eyes lit up as she threw her arms around Clara's neck. "Then it's true," she whispered. "I have a mommy again." Clara held her close, her tears falling into the child's hair. Daniel bowed his head, overwhelmed, and I felt my own tears rise. For the first time since Elise's passing, the room felt whole. Not perfect, not free from scars, but whole. A few evenings later, we gathered at the kitchen table with papers, pens, and the small card that had once lived in Elise's purse. I laid it gently on the table, its edges worn from years of use. "This card has kept Nora safe more times than I can count," I said quietly. "It should remain a rule, not a memory." Daniel nodded firmly. "From now on, it goes everywhere. School, home, outings, no exceptions." He looked at Clara, his eyes steady. "You'll carry a copy too, and we'll make sure her teachers always have it." Clara unfolded a small kit she had picked up at the pharmacy. Inside were 2 EpiPens, their cases marked in bold. She placed them on the table with deliberate care. "These stay with her at all times, one in her bag, one with us." Nora sat between them, her doll resting on her lap, watching with wide eyes. "Will it hurt?" she asked timidly. Clara reached for her hand. "It's only for emergencies, sweetheart. Most likely you'll never need it, but if you do, it will keep you safe until help arrives." Daniel picked up one of the pens, turning it over in his hand, then looked at his daughter. "This is what it means to be careful, Nora. It's not scary. It's love that protects." Together, we wrote down a list of rules. Always check menus. Always ask before trying food. Always keep the EpiPen close. Clara added a line in her neat handwriting. "Safety is family's first promise." She slid the paper toward Nora. "Do you want to decorate it with a drawing?" Nora grinned shyly and picked up her crayons. She drew a heart around the words, then a small figure of herself holding hands with Clara, Daniel, and me. The yarn doll was in the picture too, perched in her other hand. We pinned the paper to the refrigerator that evening. It wasn't just a set of instructions, it was a boundary, a vow, a symbol that the family had learned from nearly losing what mattered most. As I looked at the card, the EpiPens, and the drawing, I felt a deep calm settle in my chest. We had not erased the danger, but we had named it, prepared for it, and turned it into a shared responsibility. That was the lesson hidden in the chaos. That love means building walls strong enough to keep harm out, yet wide enough to let healing in. Nora skipped off to bed afterward, leaving her doll on the table. Clara picked it up gently, smiling through her tears. Daniel lingered, his hand resting on the refrigerator door, his eyes soft but resolute. He had begun to learn the hardest lesson of all, that love must be protected, not assumed. That night, for the first time since the wedding, I slept without waking in fear. The golden beat of safety had been struck, not in spectacle, but in the quiet certainty of boundaries drawn with love. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that carries peace instead of fear. Weeks had passed since the wedding unraveled, and life had fallen into a rhythm shaped by healing. Nora's laughter returned in fragments at first, then in steady streams that filled the rooms like sunlight spilling through the windows. Clara's voice was often the harmony to that laughter, humming while she cooked, guiding small hands over paper and crayons, soothing fevers with a calm that never wavered. I spent many evenings sitting by the window with my journal open, watching them in the yard. Nora would run across the grass, the yarn doll tucked in one hand, her curls bouncing as she called for Clara. Clara would chase her gently or sit and help her fly the kite they had mended together. Daniel often stood at a distance, his arms folded, his face a mixture of awe and remorse. Slowly he was learning that presence could not be borrowed from grand gestures. It had to be earned through consistency, through humility. Inside the house, I kept Elise close in quiet ways. Her library card, the one she had left in a book before the accident, sat tucked in a frame on the mantel. Sometimes, when Nora passed by, she would touch the glass gently, as if greeting her mother through the object. There was also the greeting card Elise had once recorded, her voice preserved in a brief message. "Love you always, my little star." On certain nights, when the air was heavy with memory, I pressed the button and let her voice fill the room. Nora would lean against me, her eyes bright with wonder. "That's Mommy," she'd whisper, smiling softly. One afternoon, I found Nora sitting on the windowsill, her yarn doll propped against the pane. The late autumn sun caught in the red threads of the doll's hair, turning it into a small flame of color. She looked at me with a smile that belonged entirely to her, unclouded and free. "Grandma," she said, "do you think Mommy can see us?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "Yes, sweetheart. I think she's right here, watching, smiling every time you laugh." Nora pressed her cheek against the glass, her small hand resting over the doll. "Then she knows I'm safe." Clara entered then, carrying a tray of cocoa, her eyes meeting mine with a tenderness that needed no words. Daniel followed, setting down his briefcase by the door, choosing to linger rather than vanish into his own silence. We gathered in the living room, mugs warming our hands, fire crackling low. It was ordinary, painfully ordinary, yet that ordinariness felt like the greatest gift of all. I thought back to that moment under the wedding table, to the slip of paper that had revealed the danger hidden in plain sight. It seemed a lifetime ago, though only weeks had passed. Fear had nearly stolen from us what Elise had entrusted, but instead it had drawn us closer. The yarn doll that had once fallen to the ballroom floor now sat safely on the sill, guarding the home where Nora was loved and seen. As I wrote in my journal that night, I realized something that had taken me years to understand. Family is not defined by ceremonies or appearances. It is chosen every day, in the meals packed with care, in the nights spent awake by a sick child's bed, in the courage to face our mistakes and seek redemption. Clara had chosen Nora from the beginning. Daniel was learning to choose her now. And I, in my quiet way, had chosen to keep watch, to carry Elise's promise like a candle never allowed to burn out. When I closed my journal, I looked once more at the framed library card on the mantel. My fingers brushed its edge, and I whispered a prayer into the quiet. "We're keeping her safe, Elise, just as you asked." The house was still, but not empty. It pulsed with the love of those who remained, with the memory of those we had lost, with the unspoken vow that what had been nearly broken would be guarded more fiercely than ever. Before going to bed, I turned to the camera of my mind, the invisible audience I had come to feel through telling this story. My voice was steady, not as a plea, but as an invitation. Family is not always the one you're given. Sometimes it's the one you choose, the one that proves its love in the smallest acts. Share your story of the family you chose. Somewhere out there, someone needs to hear it. Nora's laughter drifted faintly from her room, Clara's voice joining hers in a lullaby, and Daniel's footsteps echoed softly as he checked the locks one last time. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of them carry me into peace. For the first time in years, my heart rested easy. The doll sat on the windowsill, bathed in moonlight, its red yarn hair a beacon, a reminder of what had been lost, of what had been saved, and of the love that would continue long after the chandeliers dimmed.